My name is Pete Sexton. My background's in crop physiology. I'm a research agronomist and I supervise the Southeast Research Farm. And this is Shannon Osbornne. She's a research agronomist with USDA ARS in Brookings. And we're talking today about cover crops and really kind of to set kind of a big picture, a global view of it. The reason we're interested in cover crops is because of benefits they provide for soil quality. So if we look at soil aggregate strength and ability of the soil to hold up against wind and water erosion, a lot of that's based on the activity of the microorganisms in the soil. So the glycoproteins and polysaccharides that those microorganisms produce help glue soil particles together, so they're less likely to wash away, they're less likely to blow, and also they have more pores so that when you have rain you have better infiltration rate, the water goes in the soil instead of running off the top. So we want to feed the soil so that we can have good soil quality, good soil physical structure, so the roots in our crops can grow better and we have a better environment for the plants that we're trying to market and sell. And if we have a bare soil, there's no energy going into that soil system. So if we have a cover crop, those cover crops are photosynthesizing. They're storing energy in their own structure and in their roots, and that feeds the soil. If we've got bare black soil like this pathway over here, that soil is just heating up and the energy is radiating back to into the atmosphere, and there's no energy going into the ground there where that ground's tilled up. Whereas over here, these plants are photosynthesizing and they're contributing carbon to the system. Okay, so that said, we're going to review a number of different cover crops here. And right off, we're looking at the grasses. We've got oats and barley. These are cool season grasses. And we've got sorghum, Sudan grass, and millet there. And the virtue of these grasses are that they're going to tend to put on more biomass. They're going to provide more residue. And they're going to grow. The cool season ones here will grow into the fall and put on growth in October and maybe into November. The warm season grasses will put on a lot of biomass if it's hot, but once they get a frost, they're done. On the opposite side with the grasses, they're going to tend to tie up nitrogen. So they'll take nitrogen up out of the soil, so it won't leach out, it won't be lost, but it'll be incorporated into the structure of the plant, and then they'll break down slowly. So kind of your rule of thumb is that your cover crops that are high in fiber are going to tend to break down slower. They're going to tend to sequester nutrients. And your cover crops that have low fiber content or high in nitrogen, one or the other, either low fiber or high nitrogen, are going to tend to break down fast and release their nutrients. So if you're coming back with soybeans and you have oat or barley as a cover crop, that works fine, because soybeans are going to fix their own nitrogen and that's not a limitation. If you're coming back with corn and you have a grass cover crop, then you're probably going to have to add more nitrogen back into your system to make up for what's tied up in the cover crop. Maybe we'll go down to the next one. Okay. So in contrast to the grasses, down here we've got some field peas, and there should be some cowpea here in the mallow, and feel free to step out in the plot if you'd like to. We've got a lot of common mallow here because this used to be a feedlot. And we've got some lentils here somewhere. Okay, here are the lentils over here. So, couple points here. First one is the cowpeas as a warm season crop are going to grow well when it's warm and dry. If you had an early planting date, let's say like last year, winter wheat came off very early, you're coming back with a cover crop, cowpeas would be a good choice to have in your blend because they'll take heat, they'll take dry conditions, they'll put a lot of growth on in July, but when it freezes, they're done. So this year, looks like, at least for example in Beersford, we're still trying to get our oats out of the field. We're going to be putting our cover crops in late, and we'll weight our blend more towards the cool seasons, peas and lentils, because we're looking for growth in September and October with the later planting. So I guess what I'm trying to say is part of your picture as to what you're going to choose for blends, species to put in your blend, is going to be a function of your planting date. If you're planting early, you want to go with more warm season species in your mix, more cowpeas, millets, sorghum, Sudan grass. If you're planting late, then you'd want more oats, peas, lentils in your mix, because they'll put growth on in October after a frost, whereas these guys, not that guy, but this guy, will be done once it freezes. He won't take a frost. Second thing is, the legumes are going to fix nitrogen. First, they'll take up what nitrate's available in the soil. After that, they'll fix nitrogen, so that's the way to add some N to your system. And they tend to break down quickly, so they won't sequester the nitrogen much for the next crop. Especially if you think of corn. Corn's taking up nitrogen pretty much all the way through August. So these things are going to grow, they're going to winter kill. Even if they're not releasing nitrogen in May and June, by the time you get to July and August, they'll have broken down. So they contribute some nitrogen to the system. Any questions or comments? Yeah?
Have you guys been looking into like an economical analysis? So for a farmer to do this, I mean, a lot of these benefits are long-term, but you know, looking at the dollar amounts, you know, it's hard to put a dollar amount on aggregate stability or water infiltration.
Yeah.
But have you seen a yield boost at all?
Well, last year at Beersford, where we had a real severe drought, we got about 10 bushel per acre yield benefit, where we had cover crops versus where we didn't.
On corn?
On corn.
Any numbers on soybeans?
No, don't have any numbers on soybeans. Then on the USDA SARE program recently did a survey across the Midwest, and Jess, you correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think they had about 400 respondents, and they on average got about a 9 to 11% yield increase, what people said when they asked them if they're using cover crops and what kind of a benefit they got. But I look at it's a long-term investment. It's you're building your capital. By improving the soil, you're building the ability of your soil to withstand stress in the future. And depending on the year, you may or may not see a benefit, but over the long run, it should be there.
So when did you plant these cover crops?
These were just planted 3 weeks ago.
What about the moisture loss that these are taking up?
Okay, well, what we saw is, again, going back to last year, we had our driest growing season on record at Beersford. And where we had cover crops that winter killed, we had better yields following the cover crops than where we didn't. So even in a very dry year, those winter cover crops contributed enough to soil quality, and they contributed enough to adding residue to the surface that we got a yield boost out of it.
And I think a lot of the reason why that is, if that was last year, was the rainfalls that we got last year were very intense. We didn't have as many, but the ones that we had were very intense. And so by having the cover crop, having that residue on the soil surface, the soil was actually able to capture more of that moisture as it was coming down, as opposed to running off. And so therefore it stored it for those following crops. And we had the same thing, you know, on our research farm where we had cover crops and the residue, we actually had better yields than where we didn't have that.
But that's at Beersford.
Well, ours is here in Brookings.
Okay. What about as we go west, you know, more typical small grain area where we're a little bit more drier, what benefits will we see? You know, we're afraid to plant cover crops because we've seen the benefit of coming back the following year. We've got a moisture storage.
Right. We've worked very closely with Dan Forgy there in Gettysburg and done several experiments with Dan. And Dan has a very diverse rotation. He's utilizing no-till, and he has cover crops in all of those. And one of the big reasons for the cover crops is to make sure that he has that residue on the soil surface that he's protecting that soil surface and he's feeding that soil biology. And it is hard to put a dollar value on what that biology is doing, but I'll talk about it a little bit later. What we're doing at our laboratory is looking at what exactly is it doing to the soil microbiology, the community, the mycorrhizae fungi, and then that affects water availability and the ability of the plant to take up water and nutrients by having those relationships with the things that live in the soil. And so the cover crops feed that. They keep that soil going and they feed that biology that's down there.
So just to add a couple caveats to that. One is we are, and I don't mean to contradict anything Shannon said, that's all true and good. Just a couple things to think about in terms of managing it. One is we are feeding microorganisms, we are benefiting the soil, but we don't want to feed the things that are pathogens for our next crop plant. So when we choose a blend, you want to avoid species that are related to the crop you're planting next.
You want to add diversity.
You want to add diversity to your system. So you got to think about what you're selecting in terms, you're feeding your friends and not your enemies. So the easy way to do that is just avoid planting species that are closely related to what your cash crop is going to be next. So you don't build up the diseases that are on that. Second thing is at Beersford, we've seen with winter rye, this is winter rye cover crop grown between corn and beans. If we kill the winter rye early, we don't have any moisture problems. We haven't seen any yield losses due to the moisture that it used. And a lot of years people are dealing with excess moisture, so it's a positive thing. But even in a dry year, if we kill it early, things work out okay. But where we've let it go later, let's say go to the end of May, so that we could take that rye off for a hay crop, if following June is dry, then we pay a price for that. So
there is management involved in planting cover crops.
There is
You do have to
management.
watch what the weather is. You do have to choose your cover crop based upon, like what Peter said, what is the cash crop that you're going into. But are we having a wet spring? Leave them in a little bit longer, let them utilize that moisture, increase that soil strength. Or is it drying out where you need to go out and you need to terminate them so they don't use up too much moisture? And so you can't just plant them and let them go. You've got to think about what all is going on.
yeah, so it needs a little bit of management in terms of your species selection, avoid crops that are related to what's coming next, and then for moisture, you don't want to let them go too long if it looks like you're going to have dry weather. And what we've seen anyway, and I don't know if you've seen, Shannon, but where we have things that winter kill, by the time that they die out and you get your next spring crop in, the moisture is replenished and the benefits from it really, we haven't seen any moisture issues where they used up moisture that the crop needed. The only time we've seen where that happens is with a winter annual like winter rye, and we let it go late in the spring. And then that can happen where you get worse drought stress following the cover crop.
What is sort of your recommendation with a winter variety? Do you want to kill it 10 to 12 days prior to planting?
Well, some guys will plant into it and kill it. I guess we've been doing it about 3 years. I would say the safest thing to do would be to spray it out in early May and plant beans into it, either just before you plant the beans or after.
So yeah, I think it depends on what it is that you're going into and what your moisture issues are. We've done a lot here in Brookings where we've planted corn or beans right into the cover crop because we're able to plant easier because of the moisture amounts that we have, and then we come back in that same day and kill that cover crop. So it depends on what you've planted and what herbicide you need to get rid of that, because some of the legumes, Roundup alone won't kill them. You'll have to have maybe a tank mix of 2,4-D in the mix, which you can't do that if you're going into beans. So you've got to watch those things too.
Yeah, you got about a week you have to wait on 2,4-D?
I think so, I'm not sure, yeah.
Yeah,
So,
I think it's
so there's those things that you have to take into account also.
Yeah.
But it's really dependent upon what your spring is.
So freezing point on field peas?
I think they'll probably be good down to close to 20 degrees.
Yeah. The radishes are good down to like 15. We've had them grow here in Brookings well into, you know, Thanksgiving. The brassicas we've had.
Yeah, so that's kind of our next group here, are the brassicas. And the brassicas, these are radishes, and we've got some turnips. This is dwarf Essex, and the turnips are over there. And the dwarf Essex can overwinter, and sometimes you get some Roundup Ready canola in with it, I think. I don't know.
The seed is definitely not pure.
So you wanna, if you use a dwarf Essex, you probably wanna plan on a spring burn down with 2,4-D to get at that. So generally, brassicas are nice to have in the cover crop mix because we don't raise any brassicas as cash crops. So it adds a lot of diversity to the system, unless you happen to be a canola grower, but not much canola grown in this part of the country. So they add diversity, they take up nutrients, so they scavenge nitrogen and phosphorus, but they break down really quick. There's hardly any fiber in the leaves. So they release those nutrients that they took up. And they also, we tend to have less residue the following spring after brassica cover crops than if we had a fallow. So even though it's adding carbon to the system, it accelerates the biology so much that you end up with less residue in June after these kind of cover crops than you would if just fallow. So depending on whether you want residue or not, that's a plus or a minus. You know, if you're dealing with cold, wet soils and moisture is not too much of a limitation, then having a lot of brassicas might be just what you want to accelerate that residue breakdown. If you're further west and you're worried about running out of residue and you're worried about the soil heating up and drying out on you, then you probably want to keep the brassicas the low part of your blend. The other nice thing about the brassicas, especially the radishes, is they do kind of biological tillage. They form a big tap root, and just by kind of nature's way of providing tillage and large pores and breaking up compacted layers in the soil. And then roots of other crops will follow those channels in the following years. So it helps promote your root growth later.
So radishes and turnips, after they rot in the spring, must leave quite a large hole in the soil. Do we have any problem with no-tilling corn or soybeans?
No, we have
getting a poor stand, or
we haven't had any problems with that. No, it's kind of mush, but no, we haven't seen anything. I don't know. Have you seen anything like? No, I haven't seen that as a problem. The only thing I would say with the dwarf Essex, I have seen where dwarf Essex people went out in the spring and they thought there's not too much out there, and they planted without a burn down, and they came back with glyphosate, and there was a little bit of Roundup Ready canola, I think, in with it, and then they had to fight that. So I think if you use dwarf Essex, you probably just want to plan on 2,4-D with in a burn down application a week. You have to check the label. It's either 1 or 2 weeks before planting.
Have you guys looked at integrating livestock into any of the fields that you use cover crops on to get some sort of return on your investment?
Well, we're starting to do that. We just, actually this year we fenced about 70 acres off at Beersford, and we're starting to do cover crop grazing studies, but we haven't done any to this point. I don't know if you have data on that.
No.
It's a great idea. I imagine it's beneficial. I shouldn't say I'm sure, because I don't have data, but I suspect it will be beneficial, but I don't have numbers on it.
But then you'll want to tweak the mix that you made, that you plant geared towards that, so that you're producing that biomass, and that it's the right type of biomass, to provide the feed quality that you need for the cattle.
Yeah.
Particularly these brassicas don't have much fiber, so I think that goes right through the cow. I think it gets kind of soupy. So you wouldn't, the brassicas are good forage. They're high digestibility, but they're almost too high, so you'd want to mix some grasses with it. And that kind of leads us to our next topic, is really, we've seen with trials we've done at Beersford anyway, and working a bit with Dwayne back at Dakota Lakes, and he's seen the same thing there too. And he's done a lot more work with this than I have, is that we tend to have better performance with a blend than with individual species. So blending species together gives you a broader range of adaptation. If you've got wet points in the field or dry points in the field, the species that are adapted to those niches will tend to fill those points in, so that across the whole landscape you have much better production when you use a blend than when you just go with an individual species. And then how the proportions that you use kind of depend on your planting date and your purpose. So as I look at it, if I'm going in early, I want more warm season species in the blend to take advantage of the heat in July and August that it can pick up. If we're planting late, then I want more cool season blends because everything's probably going to get frosted out in September, and I want something that'll grow well in October to take advantage of that time frame. So your planting date affects it. If you're going into a soybean crop, then you want to have more grasses in the mix. Tie up that nitrogen. The soybeans don't need it anyway, and that gives you more of a rotation kick. And the brassicas are good either way, but they do impact your residue situation. So if you're trying to get rid of residue, use more brassicas. If you want residue, don't put very many brassicas in your mix. And your legumes add nitrogen. And again, depending on what's coming next, your cowpeas or lentils or peas could be useful for you if you're going into corn. If you're going into soybeans again, then that's not really doing a lot for you. So you want to have a blend. You want to have more diversity, the better. And you just got to think about how that's going to interact with your next crop as far as pathogens go. And with moisture, I would say your main thing I would think about is if you have a winter annual, you're going to have to kill it early in the spring, or otherwise it may come back to haunt you, unless it's a wet spring, and then you'll be glad for it. I don't know, Shannon, you?
We okay on time?
I think so.
Okay, I got a little handout. We've been doing research on cover crops since about 2000, and what I did is just have kind of a front and back, some of the summary results that we've had from the research that we've been doing. So we were really just focusing on trying to use cover crops to utilize excess moisture that we had in the spring. And it was kind of naive, kind of a little bit narrow focus, and we've really expanded and developed new techniques that we're utilizing our cover crops for. And one of the big things that Pete talked about was soil health and the importance of soil health and how these cover crops really feed that soil health. And so this first page here, the first one is talking about soil mycorrhizae fungi. Well, soil mycorrhizae fungi are these fungi that live in the soil, and they develop a relationship with our crops. And when they develop this relationship, they enable the crop to take up nutrients better as well as moisture. And so what we have found in our traditional corn, soybean, or our continuous corn, we've really decreased the number of mycorrhizae and the diversity of mycorrhizae that we have in the soil. And so what we are trying to do is utilize these cover crops to bring some of that diversity back. And so that's kind of what that first graph is there. It just shows you the number of spores. So these would be the number of spores that were on a corn plant that were grown within these different cover crops. The first one there is a none cover crop. You can see how low that is. And then some of the other ones there where we've added more mycorrhizae to that soil. And so, as I said, it's going to increase the plant's availability to take up nutrients as well as moisture. Pete talked a little bit about the legumes and the ability of the legumes to add nitrogen to the system. That's kind of what that second graph is there, is looking at nitrogen mineralization. So this is looking at the amount of nitrogen that would have been mineralized in the corn crop following cover crops. So those cover crops would have grown the following fall and spring. We would have come back in, planted that corn, and this is kind of an estimate of the nitrogen that would have been produced. You can see for the clover and the vetch, we have more overall nitrogen being released to that system than where we had a fallow, which would be no cover crop, or rye, which is one of the grasses. The bottom graph just basically looks at the ability of those cover crops to scavenge nitrogen. So the dark bars there are that's corn yield, sorry. the dark bars there are where we added nitrogen, and the bottom bar or the light bars are where no nitrogen was added. And you can see where we have cover crops, we're having an increase in yield compared to the no cover crop, which is the first graph. So those cover crops are taking up that nutrient and supplying it there to the following crop. So it kind of goes back to that one that you were asking about. We've also looked at, if you go to the back, we've looked at the ability of cover crops to decrease the wheat residue. You can see there's an awful lot of wheat residue here on the soil surface. That can cause problems in a no-till situation with cool soil temperatures and maybe impede that corn emergence. And so we've looked at adding cover crops and looking at what it does to residue decomposition. So that graph is basically, we went out right after we harvested the wheat, looked at the amount of wheat residue that was there, planted our cover crops, allowed those cover crops to grow all fall and all winter, and went back and looked at the amount of wheat residue that was still there. And so what we can see, what Pete talked about, was those ones that have a lower C to N ratio, which is those light bars, decompose more wheat residue than when we have a higher C to N ratio. So that third bar there, the field pea and the Timothy, had a very low C to N ratio. It was able to decompose more of that wheat residue. When it decomposes it, the important thing is that it's putting it into the soil. It's feeding the soil, it's feeding those microbes. All of those nutrients are being cycled and making that soil more healthy for the following crop. So in comparison to something like one of the sunflowers had a lot of decomposing with the hairy vetch there as well. The spring canola has a very high C to N ratio, and we didn't get as much wheat decomposing for ours compared to what Pete was saying earlier. And then we have an experiment where we have been looking at the impact of removing corn residue for ethanol production. So we've had a little bit of interest in that here lately about removing that residue to produce ethanol. And as an agronomist, I'm really concerned about what impact that's going to have on the soil health, all of those things. And so that middle graph there is looking at, after 8 years of removing corn residue, the impact on soil carbon. So the first bar is where all we are doing is removing grain. All the residue is remaining on the soil surface. The 40%, we remove the grain, we come back with a stalk chopper, chop those stalks, put them in a windrow, bale them, and remove them. So it's about 40% of the residue going off. And then we come in with a silage chopper and remove about 90% of the residue. So those dark bars are where we have no cover crop. And you can see over 8 years, we've had a significant decrease in soil carbon. And that soil carbon is important for nutrient holding capacity, water holding capacity, carbon sequestration, all of those things is important with soil carbon. But when we add a cover crop to that system, those are the light bars, you can see that we're negating some of that negative impact of removing that residue. We also see this, we've looked at aggregate stability and aggregate size distribution, erodibility. Pete was talking about the soil being removed by wind and water erosion, and we're seeing a very similar trend as soil carbon with those things. Yes, sir.
How soon do we see results though? Okay, this is planted how long? 3 weeks ago. How soon do we see results, in South Dakota as you're planting corn, harvesting October, November? We don't have much time, it's freeze up.
So is your question, how long does the crop have to grow before it has an impact?
Benefit.
Okay. One of the interesting things about this particular experiment is it is a corn soybean rotation. And so trying to establish those cover crops in corn and beans is a lot more difficult than trying to establish them after a small grain. Here you got your small grain out in the 1st of August. You can go out, drill those cover crops. It's nice and easy. But that's not necessarily the case in that corn and bean rotation. And so we've done a number of different things. We have put a Gandy spreader on the back of a highboy, gone out and broadcast the cover crops, and you kind of get mixed results. It's very dependent upon the microclimate under the canopy at that point, whether you're going to get those to grow. We have used earlier maturing varieties of corn and beans, and then gone back out like September 20th and planted those cover crops. And I didn't think, going out there's really not much there. But it overwinters, it stays there, and it's there in the spring. And so we've had very little above ground biomass in this particular experiment, but we've had huge things happening in the soil with soil carbon, with soil aggregate stability, infiltration. All of those things have really been impacted by that root system. And just because we can't see it doesn't mean that there's not things going on down there. And so it has taken, we put cover crops in this experiment in 2005. When we collected samples in 2008, we were starting to see a trend. It wasn't what we call statistically significant, but there was a trend that it was improving it. And so we went back out last summer, and man, there's really a huge difference in soil carbon and aggregate stability. And so you don't have to have a lot going up above ground to really have things going on below ground. And that's what we are just kind of getting to the tip of the iceberg, being able to measure and put a value on. And it's very hard to put that economic value on those things. But the producers who really have been utilizing cover crops, they preach it. Dan, he's really a proponent of the importance of cover crops and what it has done to his overall system. And so it's not going to be the first year. It's going to be more long term, but there's a lot going on underneath there that we're not seeing. And so we are just kind of tipping the iceberg on what it is that we're finding out. And it has a lot to do with that microbial community. The mycorrhizae, the fungi, the bacteria, all of those things are very important to it. And so that's kind of an overview. The bottom one here is just some indicators of soil health that we've been looking at and trying to evaluate how cover crops have a positive impact on those. So I guess any closing statements or any other questions that you guys have?
I would just throw in there, we're kind of, this whole science is a bit in its infancy, and it's logical that we'd see benefits. They seem to accrue over time. So just by way of suggestion, I think maybe you might want to pick a field and start cover cropping it, but be consistent with it. Don't just do it once, but be consistent and keep cover cropping it, and then see over time what benefits accrue. I know we were at a meeting here in Michigan last September. There were some fellows there from, it's quite a ways east of here in Indiana, but they had been cover cropping for 10 or 15 years. And they had one farm that they didn't cover crop, and they said after about 5 years, they said we're losing resources by not cover cropping everything, and they just cover crop their whole farm now. But I think I wouldn't look for a one-shot wonder. I would look at it as a long-term investment, and if it's something you want to experiment with, then therefore you need to do it on a long-term basis. So you probably want to pick a field or an area and cover crop it consistently, and use that as your benchmark.
What about weed control? We see some different weed species out here besides.
Well, this is kind of a poor example because this is an old yard, and there's a lot of mallow in here. At our situation, we put Roundup down either just before or after planting. We haven't seen that big weed pressure in our situation.
Herbicide-resistant weeds. You gonna see the problem with that with cover crops?
I guess I don't see how they'd contribute to it. Generally, as Shannon said, most of the cover crops are being done in small grains, and usually in small grain systems there's enough diversity in the herbicides being used that the herbicide-resistant weeds are less of an issue. Thinking of the glyphosate-tolerant ones. I guess if you've got cover crops, you're less likely to have winter annual weeds because you'd be competing with them in the fall. I guess that would have to be something a fellow would have to judge on a case-by-case basis, and maybe there would be something that would call for an herbicide application in the cover crop. I guess it would depend on the field and what you've got for a mixture. I don't know, Shannon, do you have any? Yeah. I don't see as a rule, I guess I can't see how it would make things any worse, but it might be something that needs to be managed.